Hey everybody, and welcome back to my channel, and welcome to this week's Friday Reads, where I talk about everything that I read in the last week. I talk about what I'm currently in the middle of, and we also talk about what I think I'm going to be getting to in the next week. And as has been the case more often recently, there's a lot to talk about, so we're just going to jump right in. So the very first book, which was a holdover from last week, is Tristan Strong Punches a Hole in the Sky by Kwame Mbalia. This is the first book in a middle grade fantasy trilogy. It's part of the Rick Riordan Presents series, so it's very heavily based in mythology. In this case, it is especially Black American mythology, and folk tales is our basis for this series. But essentially, we're following our main character of Tristan Strong, and things have just been kind of going poorly in his life. His best friend recently died in a bus accident, and Tristan has a number of feelings about that, as is pretty understandable. And also Tristan recently had his first boxing match, which he thought he was absolutely going to win, and he absolutely did not. So his parents decide to go ahead and send him down to Alabama to stay with his grandpa and his nana for a while. And on his first night there, a figure appears seemingly out of nowhere to try to steal Tristan's best friend's journal. And of course, because this best friend is now dead, Tristan is like, absolutely not, and goes chasing after the thief, which turns out to be a figure from a mythology, I believe, Gum Baby. And that's kind of how the story starts, and everything kind of goes from there. So I said this last week, and I don't have a ton to add to what I said last week, but essentially I don't actually have a good understanding of Black American mythology or folktales. As it turns out, as I was thinking more on it, I actually just don't have a good understanding of any kind of American folktales, pretty much at all. Whether it's Black or white or whatever, I just don't have a good understanding of them. I think that at some point I went over some of them in class, but like I'm not even convinced that happened. So there was a lot here that I just didn't have a good grounding for. I also am not very strongly, I don't have a strong knowledge of Black American culture or Southern culture, which kind of plays into this a little bit as well. So like there was a lot of stuff where I just didn't have the grounding, and so I did feel a little bit adrift in this for probably the first 100 to 200 pages. I would have preferred a little bit more explanation as to who a lot of these characters were. I'm not surprised we didn't get it. I just specifically wanted more. I think it was because I did feel adrift, and I didn't want to feel adrift anymore. Another thing with this is I did not necessarily love the characters. So eventually, by the end, I did think that Tristan was just fine, but I didn't really like him in the beginning. And a lot of the other side characters I didn't necessarily like. By the end, some of them I had kind of mellowed out my feelings towards them, but I can't really say that I liked any of them. And personal preference, so do with that what you will. But like, because I didn't like the characters, and I didn't necessarily like the world, I did really struggle with this. I think that the plot itself was fine. I think it was pretty, not exactly standard, but also I don't think specifically unique. And the thing that I did think was done really, really well is in this world, storytelling. There are storytellers, and as they tell stories, it's literally magic. Like, the stories themselves are magic, and I just absolutely adored that aspect of it. Like, I could have sat with that for quite a while. I really appreciated it. So yeah, I finished this book, but like, very mixed feelings. Ultimately, I did not actually rate this, and the reason being is I don't think that I have the expertise to evaluate whether this book did a good job with what it was trying to do, because I just didn't have the grounding necessary. I'm glad I finished it. It gave me some exposure to a lot of things that I didn't really think that I needed to explore more of, but clearly I do. But yeah, I'm not qualified at all to tell you if this is a good book with what it did. I will say that like the aspects that I could tell didn't necessarily work as well for me. But there were some really interesting things too. So very mixed bag, but I did finish this book. And then also a holdover from last week that I finished is One Fell Sweep by Ilona Andrews. This is the third book in the Innkeeper Chronicles series, which is an urban fantasy. I actually don't know the genre. I don't know what genre to put this in. I kind of put it in urban fantasy, but it defies genres. But essentially we're following our main character of Dina, who is an innkeeper, and her inn serves as a way station for aliens as they travel through the galaxy, except the rest of Earth does not know that aliens exist. So there's a lot of secrecy involved within her job. And in this specific book, things get very busy, very complicated, very quickly. First, Dina gets a note from her sister, Maud, that she needs help getting off of the planet that she's currently living in. And then also this alien race comes to see Dina to see if she would be willing to host them. But it's a very tricky situation because this alien species is actually being hunted down by another alien species that is intent on genocide. And so it's like she has to guarantee the safety of her guests. So is she going to try to attempt this? It's a lot of stuff going on, and the story kind of goes from there. And there's a lot about this that I actually really like. I like the characters. I have really gotten to love these characters. I love this group, especially that kind of keeps coming together. I love the interactions. I especially adore how Maud and Helen integrated into this group, especially because it allowed Dina to show a different facet of her character that we haven't seen up to this point. You just interact differently with your siblings than you do with guests who are under your care, basically. And so it was really great to see that. I loved those interactions so much. I really liked that we got a resolution to the will they won't they situation that we had going on. It's not exactly a surprise how it resolved, but it was nice to actually see it. I loved the plot of this. Like, just everything going on with this alien species was a delight. I just really enjoyed what was done with it. However, this is where we get to the negatives. There was some issues with pacing, and there's actually some issues, I think, with the structure. So one of the things that I think, I'm not an expert in how to structure stories, so like take this all with a grain of salt, but a lot of what I've noticed is that there's two basic chapters, maybe more, but like I've noticed two. Again, not an expert, but essentially there are the chapters that kind of have their own story arc. And so as you're reading a book with this, it's like each chapter kind of does this, and then as each chapter goes along, the story kind of goes up like that, right? And so you have like the arch, and then it comes up to the climax, and then it comes back down, and then you get into the next chapter, and it keeps doing that. And that's a lot of how books are generally structured, because it's a really good way to bring the reader along, because those mini story arcs are pushing the overarching narrative forward. It's just generally a really good way to do it. But sometimes you also need these other kind of interlude chapters that are not necessarily structured that way, because you just need to impart information to the reader. We need to tie up loose ends, whatever. And it's okay to have those like within the story, because it makes sense. And it generally doesn't interrupt the flow. And this felt like the chapters were a lot of interlude chapters, where it didn't really have that overarching, like that story arc within each chapter. And I think it suffered for it, honestly. Like, each chapter was like 30 pages long. It wasn't a cohesive, this is all about, like, this has a narrow focus on this one kind of plot arc. Like, it was a lot. And so unfortunately, because it wasn't as narrow, each chapter was not as narrowly defined, as like we kept going from one thing to another, and I kept thinking, when is this chapter going to end? Which is not good. You don't necessarily want your reader to be like, I'm not enjoying this as much. And so I think that if they had just made shorter chapters, they could have narrowed the focus enough to get a little bit more of an arc going, that it could have brought me along in a much better way instead of me forcing myself to continue on with these chapters. Like, it was hard because I was enjoying so much of it and it just didn't pull me along in the same way. And so that was a little frustrating, I will admit that. But it really did prevent me from being able to immerse myself fully in this book. So I still really like a lot of what's going on. I was just a little disappointed with the execution of it. So I ended up giving this 4 stars. And then we have my very first DNF, not of the month, but of this week, and that is Heroines Journey by Sarah Kuhn. This is the 3rd book in the Heroine Complex series, which is an adult superhero fantasy type series where we're following this group of 3 women who are best friend related, whatever, like it's 2 best friends and a little sister, and essentially all of them have superhero like superpowers, and they're all kind of coming into their own in each individual book. And so this 3rd book is actually Beatrice's book, and she is the little sister, and her older sister has told her in no uncertain terms that she is not to become a superhero, but Beatrice is really not down with that. And so when she starts hearing this voice, she decides she's going to investigate and prove that she is worthy of being a superhero. And the story goes from there. And like I said, I DNF'd this at page 24. This is a book that basically, in many, many ways, I shouldn't have picked up, because it was like, I didn't love the first 2 books in this series as much as I wanted to. I really wanted to love them, and I really just didn't. Like, the story, the writing style didn't necessarily work for me. Some of the aspects of how the stories were executed were not as high quality as, or like the quality of it wasn't as good. And also, again, it didn't work for me from just like a general standpoint. Like, even if it was the best executed thing, it still wouldn't have worked for me. So like, there were some real reasons to not continue this series. And even like, as I put it on my TBR, and as I requested it from the library, and as I picked it up from the library, and as I decided to read it, I kept thinking, I don't think I actually want to read this. So this DNF is 100% me. Okay. It says nothing about the series. It's just like, this was a series that I shouldn't have continued on with, and I did anyway. However, what I will say is I am really glad that I still picked it up, because this is one of the series where, like, I really wanted to get this book because I really wanted to see Beatrice's journey, because she is like, I really liked her as a side character. And so like once I got into her head, I was just like, oh no, this is not a place I want to be, and this does not work for me. And so that's why I DNF'd it. But I think that if I hadn't at least tried, I definitely would have wondered what if. And so because I did give it a chance, and because I did have such a strong reaction of, no, I don't actually, this isn't working for me, I can close the door on this series and walk away and feel perfectly fine about it, instead of have lingering doubts about maybe I should have picked up the 3rd book. So yes, big DNF, not the book's fault, necessarily the book's fault. Still glad that I tried anyway. And then I actually had another DNF, and that is Like You Love Me by Adriana Locke. This is an adult contemporary romance where we're following, don't even remember the names of the main characters, but we're following Sophie and Holden. Sophie is the local proprietor of a bed and breakfast who is very much struggling financially, like does not know how she's going to keep this bed and breakfast going. Holden is somebody who used to visit this town as a kid, like his grandpa lives there, and now he has come back to help out his grandfather at the veterinary practice that his grandfather has. And so they were friends as kids, and then they decide, you know what, let's help each other out and get married. Basically, Holden is going to take care of Sophie's financial problems, and Sophie is just basically going to be there to show that he is a responsible, stable person, so that it looks really good for this job, that like his dream job that he's applying for in Florida, and the story goes from there. And like, y'all, this is another one I probably shouldn't have picked up, but it was just, it's my bad. Like, I didn't really think about how that job, the fact that he's required to be married to be seen as stable and responsible, was going to play out in this story and how I was going to react to it. Because if I had thought about it for like 3 seconds, I would have been like, oh, this isn't for me. Because my immediate reaction to that is that's terrible, because being married doesn't show that you're responsible and stable, and not being married doesn't mean you're not responsible and stable. And like anybody who's hiring for a job who thinks that that's a huge red flag that you should maybe just walk away from the job. So like I was already screaming at Holden about that. So it was not good. And so if I had thought about it again, I probably wouldn't have even tried this. But the other thing that I found was that I found the writing to be really flat. So like they have chemistry. They had chemistry as kids, and coming back to work, coming back together as adults, they also they just kind of pick up, like they have the chemistry there, which is fine. But I think that you kind of have to work because you're relying on the childhood friendship to be the foundation and the setup of this relationship. But like we didn't spend a ton of time with it, and we didn't spend a ton of time like establishing the chemistry and I think the way that makes it work. So it felt very, very flat to me. So at about page 47, I want to say, is where I was just like, this isn't working for me. It's not really my thing. I'm not gonna love where these tropes go anyway, so I'm going to just go ahead and DNF it. And then the last book that I finished, DNF'd, whatever, is The Magpie Lord by KJ Charles. And this is a historical romance and fantasy too. Historical, fantastical romance. I'm not really sure how to do that. But anyway, it's an adult book. It's a romance with fantasy. But in it, we're following our main characters of Lord Crane and Stephen Day, Mr. Day. But basically Lord Crane has a curse that has been put on him, and so he hires Stephen Day to come help him with that curse. And it becomes apparent very quickly that it's not just a curse, there is so much more going on, and so they have to figure out what is happening before bad things can happen. And the story goes from there. And this was really interesting, and not like, some of it worked for me and some of it didn't. So what I will say is that this is a very dark, the curse aspect of it is pretty dark. I actually almost DNF'd it just because I was not prepared for that. And within the first couple chapters, we see what the curse is doing. So massive trigger warnings in this. Basically, the curse is at certain times of the day, Lord Crane ends up having his mind taken over, and he ends up with some pretty strong suicidal thoughts, and ends up attempting suicide. And it has happened multiple times in the last couple of months, and because we're there with him for an episode, again, massive trigger warnings. And also I wasn't prepared for that, and that's not generally something that I'm mostly okay with. So like, that's not something that I seek out in my books. It's actually a deterrent for me for the most part. So yeah, not really like thrilled with that. So very dark. That is just one part of the trigger warnings. There's so many. I would strongly recommend seeking them out. But also the romance itself is a little bit on the darker side. It's kind of like, we talk about the like sweet to steamy scale, but there's also like a fluffy to dark kind of scale. And this isn't like full real dark, but it is definitely it's definitely darker than a lot of traditional publishing. And it also steps off the path into some kink territory, which again is fine. It's more dominant submissive kind of stuff, not really bondage or like sadomasochism, but definitely dominant submissive kind of kink. And so it's just kind of like, it's definitely a step away from most traditionally published romance. Also, which I was not expecting. So what I will say is that I did like the characters. I don't think they were developed well enough to my particular tastes, especially for a romance. But because it's a 3-part series, I'm assuming like we're gonna get more. The bare bones are good though. I really like the interactions between the characters. I especially love the interactions between Lord Crane and his manservant Merrick. It was so good. I was so happy with that, especially with the short story at the end of this book called Interlude with Tattoos. That was so good. I really appreciated Merrick and Lord Crane in that. I thought the plot itself was actually fairly interesting. It moved really fast. That part of it was great. The magic itself had an interesting foundation, but frequently I don't think it was explained very well. And I actually don't think the plot points were explained as well. And so because I had some questions about like the magic and the plot, and I don't think they were ever fully like explained. Like there's an explanation given, but it wasn't enough of an explanation for me specifically. And so I felt, again, this is another book where I felt a little bit adrift in that sense. And so like, I don't know, it's hard because there was definitely some good things that were done. There was definitely some things that were to my personal taste. And then there were some things that were not done well with the writing and some things that were not to my personal taste. So it was a mixed bag all around. And so I think I'm going to continue with the series, but not for a while. And I ended up giving this one 3.25 stars. This is the first book that I read for the Orillium readathon Europe thing, readathon. This is so that I can have a crow companion for my character. I know Magpie, Crow, they're both corvids. It's close enough. So I now get to have a crow companion. And that brings us to what I am in the middle of. So I'm actually only in the middle of The Hammer of Thor by Rick Riordan. This is the second book in the Magnus Chase and the Gods of Asgard series, which is a young adult middle grade fantasy series where we're following Magnus Chase, who in the first book was kind of pressed into the family business, which has a lot to do with Norse mythology. I don't know how to talk about it without spoiling it. I'll try to come up with a better explanation. But this book, The Hammer of Thor, has been lost for too long. And the giants are kind of gearing up for invasion because they know that nobody can stop them. And so between that and some other weird happenings, Magnus decides to go investigate, and the story goes from there. And I am now on page 325. So I have about 125 pages left. And it's fine. What I'm finding is it's very, very similar to the first book in this series. Like just the kind of plot we have and the plot beats we have, like it just feels very, very similar. So it's still fine. It's not my favorite, but it's fine. It's doing something that I think that the age group, the people that the kids in this age range will appreciate. So like I'm okay with it. But yeah, it's not my favorite, but it's going okay. I do like some of the character development that we've gotten though, and we do have an introduction of a gender fluid character, which I think is really nice. As an adult reading it, it does sometimes hammer home some of these points in like really obvious ways, like what they're doing. But honestly, as I think about this as a book for middle grade or young adult readers, what it's doing is it's giving you the readers the vocabulary of how to talk to people who are gender fluid without completely screwing it up and putting your foot in your mouth. So I actually do really appreciate it for that. But yeah, so I should be finishing this up pretty soon. So since I have, I guess now we can just move into what's going to happen next week. So obviously I'm going to finish up Hammer of Thor, but I also need to read Not Your Villain by C.B. Lee. This is the next book in the Sidekick Squad series. And this is my reading, the other book that I need to read for the Orillium readathon. So this is going to be, these two are going to be my priority. After that, I'm not entirely certain what I'm going to get into. And the only other thing that I wanted to do very quickly, because I have talked about it in previous Friday reads, is give you an update on my knitting. So the scrap blanket that I'm making for my younger child, I believe we left off at this blue, right? That's like right here. So all of this is new. Again, these are all colors that my child picked out, so that's why it's a little bit all over the place. And I also started another project, which is going to be a year-long project, and it is a temperature blanket. I just recently got my needles. It was a whole saga with like people not shipping it, and then it's shipping, but then like it's still technically not delivered like a month and a half later. And so I reordered, and then I finally got it. But this is what it looks like so far. I am into February. This is a really nice, like chunky kind of yarn with huge needles. So it's not taking me any time at all, and I am loving how it is turning out. So that is it. Those are all of my updates. Like I said, next week is going to be Hammer of Thor, Not Your Villain, and then I have no idea. So we shall see what happens next Friday. So if you have any thoughts or feelings about anything I talked about in this video, please leave me a comment down below. But that is all I have. So if you liked it, please give it a thumbs up. Subscribe if you want to. And until next time, have happy reading, and I will see you in my next video.